According to the earliest sources we have in the New Testament, did Jesus rise physically, bodily, with the same body we have from the dead? Or was it spiritual and in some other way he was understood to have risen? Later gospel accounts seem to imply more of a physicality, but there seems to be mixed messages in the New Testament on what is the reality. I was honored, MythVision was, a few years ago to travel to Colorado and interview Professor Elaine Pagels, expert on Nag Hammadi literature, and she is obviously a legend in the field, to ask her the question, is the body physical or is it spiritual in the earliest sources? Literal view of the resurrection versus spiritual in the early church. There seems to be this hot topic idea. Professor James Tabor, for example, writes that Paul believed Jesus' resurrection in Paul's teaching 1 Corinthians 15 was spiritual. He didn't believe this Jesus died and rose in the same body, according to James Tabor. Now I pitch it to you because it sounds that the Gnostics also thought, in Pauline sense, that this is a new body. Not a physical, corporeal, DNA, tendons, bone, skin, flesh, literal, even though the Gospels do hint at some of this.
That's such an important question. There are many different people who attest to having seen Jesus alive after he died. Paul was the first. He's writing, as you know, earlier than the Gospels. And he said he never met Jesus. He never saw him physically. Paul's account is that he saw a blinding light. He heard a voice, and he knew that Jesus was speaking to him. He never saw a physical person, but the blinding light and the voice, a vision he had, it transformed his life, right? And when he's asked about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, and people say, well, what do you mean resurrection? With what body do they come, the dead? And he said, well, they don't come with the ordinary body that we have now. There are many kinds of bodies. There are animal bodies and fish bodies and bird bodies. And then there are bodies of light. Like the sun, the stars. What you call their bodies are actually photons, particles of light, through which you can see. But it's a different kind of a body. And Paul says, when they're raised, it's not the corruptible body. It has to be transformed into he calls it a spiritual body. And he doesn't tell you what it looks like because he doesn't know. It's a mystery. It's a mystery. Get that? Will be changed. There'll be a transformation. There is some life after this one in this corporeal body, but it is a mystery, and it's in a different kind of body. So Paul says many people saw Jesus. He never says they touched him, they realized that it was his bones and his flesh. But many people, he said, had a sense that he was resurrected and they saw him alive. Later, in the New Testament Gospels, when they're written, the people who wrote the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John, give you different stories about how people say they saw him. Some say, well, Luke says he came through the room. He came through the walls. And we thought it was a ghost. That's in Luke, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's Luke 21. We thought it was a ghost. And he said, no, touch me and see. I'm physically present. So he seemed to be physically present. And then yet he vanished again. Other stories that Luke tells, for example, when people are walking on the road to Emmaus, they see a man, they walk, they talk with him. Finally, they sit down to dinner with him. He blesses the bread and the wine, and they say, it's Jesus. And he disappears. So I don't think Luke cared too much whether you said, we think he was physically there, or I think it was a vision. Luke just wants to know, he had more testimonies of different people put together to say, well, a lot of people saw him in lots of different ways. John does the same thing. He says, some people say they physically touched him, but in John's gospel, when Mary Magdalene is supposed to be the first to have seen him. He says, "Don't touch me. I haven't yet gone up to the Father." And he disappears. So in the early movement, followers of Jesus didn't care so much. How did you see him? Exactly what? They just said, "Do you believe Jesus is raised from the dead? If you do, you're one of us." It's 200 years later that teaching of resurrection is turned into a dogma. You have to believe it this way. You have to believe that Jesus was raised bodily, in the flesh, went up into heaven in the flesh. The first creeds talk about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So when Christians are trying to formulate and say, "Okay, I'm going to tell you what you've got to believe. It's got to be this way, not that way." We don't like the ambiguity of the early stories. We want to nail it down. Sorry about the...
Oh, yeah.
We want to make it very specific so that there's no ambiguity. So that becomes the teaching of the church. And it still is, right? Jesus raised bodily in the flesh. That is a late development. That's why when we go back to the early sources and try to understand how Jesus' early followers experienced the sense that he was alive after he died, we have to find there's a lot more range of opinion. And that's the kind of range of opinion that leaders in the church didn't want. They wanted a simple answer, and they got one. They made one.
I wonder if John, the Gospel of John, has a later redactor putting in the flesh and he ate and Thomas touched his wounds. I mean, like, it sounds interpolated maybe in that idea, or just a little late in the game.
Well, it seems to be an attack on people who say that the resurrection was experienced as a vision. Because the Gospel of Thomas is associated with the disciple Thomas with a kind of deeper teaching. And the Gospel of John, I think, was written to say, the Gospel of Thomas says, not only was Jesus among us, but he taught us that we are like him. He says at the end, "I am the Son of God. You come from the same source. You are also sons of God." That's part of John's gospel too. But John wants to say, you can't just believe it any way. You can't believe that you are somehow equivalent to Jesus, as these other Christians suggest he taught. You actually can't believe it the way Thomas taught it in the Gospel of Thomas. So John creates a whole story that isn't in Matthew, Mark, or Luke about how Jesus appeared to the disciples and he made them apostles, but Thomas wasn't with them. And Thomas becomes suspect in John's gospel. And then John creates a story that's in no other gospel, in which the disciples say to Thomas, "We saw the Lord." Thomas, being somebody who just doesn't believe, he has to have gnosis. He has to experience it himself. "I don't believe it." So then John says, "Well, actually, Jesus came back just for Thomas and said, 'Okay, here I am in the body. You can touch me. Put your hand in my side. I'm actually here.'" And that, I think, is written by somebody rather late to challenge the idea that you could have different ways of experiencing or understanding resurrection. John's gospel at the end wants to say he was there in the flesh.
And it does. That is a good explanation. The Thomas, I mean, you literally just launched like 5 different books that could be written on this subject, because just that idea that Thomas is the one who's the doubter. He's the one that you should be suspect of.
Yes.
And here you have a gospel written by a guy named Thomas that's supposed to be the disciple. And don't take his account. He's a doubter.
The Gospel of Thomas probably is earlier than John's Gospel. That's what surprised me. And so Thomas is associated with secret teaching. And And when John wants to tell you what you have to believe or else you go into eternal damnation, then you have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God the way John teaches. Then he wants to say, Thomas, he doesn't know anything. He's just the one who doesn't have any faith. What I mean by faith is belief that Jesus is exactly who I say he is, God walking on earth. And the only one in whom you must believe.
As well as the belief that he literally rose from the dead. And I think the author's winking at everyone who's reading this, and he's saying, blessed are those who don't see, but believe this teaching that he's physical. I know that I'm not going to appear to you physically. Jesus isn't going to show up in your living room and say, all right, here, come on, let me show you. All right, now believe. But blessed are those who don't see this, yet believe this.
Yes, and John is mysterious gospel. It has its own spiritual quality. Because at the end, you remember the author says, well, there are hundreds of other things that countless things Jesus did. I mean, the world couldn't contain all the books that would have to be written if everything were written down. So John says there's a lot you don't know. Mm-hmm. There's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot you don't know. And opens it up. And yet, he also wants to put the brakes on believing it any other way. Then he sets it forth. I'm sure he's a very devout and serious believer with one particular perspective. But in the New Testament, we have 4 Gospels. And apart from that, we have more. So now we can open our understanding to a range of perspectives.
I love that. That is what makes me love this even more, is just getting the range of various views and seeing what people thought, why. Something that came to mind to get technical or like textual criticism idea, I wonder, Dr. Ehrman thinks that there were 4 different distinct redactional, if you will, compilation, is that the right term? Mm-hmm. Compositions to John.
Versions, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
And Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald sees 3 layers.
Yeah.
He thinks the earliest, most primitive, is kind of a Euripides, the Bacchae kind of thing. And we'll get into some of that maybe later. But it's interesting. It's just fun.
They get into the weeds with John, which I don't really.
And they'll probably say, well, you're in the weeds, because, everyone's got different weeds they like to look at. But is it possible that this is a later...
You raise a very important question, that the Gospel of John that we have in our Bibles may be revised several times. Most likely the way Mark was revised several times, not only in the Gospel of Mark, but also in Matthew and Luke. So people were adding to these early texts. And the Gospel of John may be revised later. Many people think the last chapter is added on. And it's hard to think that it isn't, because there are contradictory views even within the text we have, as the scholars who work on them show. So yes, this tradition develops and takes on definitive form in the creeds. That's what, 2nd century to 4th century, that's more than 200 years after Jesus dies, 150 years, that this becomes a codified set of beliefs that you must say when you're baptized. However, there were Christians who followed Gnostic teachings who said the same creed, believed it, and then said yes, and then you can go from there to the other levels as well. The Orthodox said, nope, you've got to stop there. Tertullian says, one of the fathers of the church in Africa, he says, when you've got the truth, you just stop. You don't need to go anywhere. No more questions. Questions make people heretics. You just stop right there. We've got the truth. We've got the rule of faith. We know exactly what we believe. We say this, 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 and this. Those are our statements. Stop. Don't go any further. The rest will get you into dangerous waters.
I thought you might have said in your book, The Gnostic Gospels, that Tertullian, or one of the church fathers, he was very Orthodox originally. But
yes. Yes, that's another story.
Let's save that for another one. Let's tease everyone and we'll do another recording.
Okay. Yes. Yes, he went off the rails a bit.